There's so much stuff coming in.
At 6:30.
You might have to share a little bit
And
with
what are
this.
you handing away now, sir? Are you giving away free stuff?
I only have a few announcements.
Everything's free.
Announcements tonight. I'll just cover the month of January. First, we have.
I've got a class in Charlotte.
Let's
see if you guys can share a little bit. I might have enough for everybody. We'll see. Card.
From 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the Patterson School for Boys.
I think I've got enough
We're down to
for everybody. We'll see.
22 people registered for it. So if you like to come out and tie, you just bring your own tools, all the materials.
You can't lollygag.
You just need your tools, your ice, and lunch will be provided.
This is the whole
Second,
program.
there's
New car.
tying on
You doing good?
Thursday, July 22nd at Carolina Mountain Sports from 6:30 to 8.
Hey
Statesville.
guys. Doing good.
Space is limited. It's free, but you need to go ahead and register. So the whole
Maybe I'll
season
have enough for everybody.
and it tends to fill
This is
up.
the whole program.
Next, we have class in the grass on Saturday, the 24th,
Easy chair, huh?
10 to 2 p.m.
Good.
That's at the Salisbury Community Park. Michael Helms is heading that up. And then we have on Tuesday, the 27th, we have Pine Line and Tacos. That's at the Voice Brewery off Country Club Road in Winston-Salem. Again, they reserve a table
You doing
for
all
us. They're always happy for us to be there. The taco truck is really good, and that's over in Winston. Although not in the month of January, we just posted Whistle
And
Stop trip in like a day and a
We got
half.
cards.
We're up to 8 people. 2 more people are going to sign up tonight. We're capping it at 12. So if anybody's interested, go to our website and you can pay and sign up for the trip there. That's probably the best trip we do all year. It's always a great time. Bill, you want to do something?
My honor tonight to introduce Alen Baker. We do a lot of work now together, him and I, and a couple other people for the Southern Fly Tires Guild. Alan is part of the NCSU Computer Science Hall of Fame. STM Legends?
Southern Trap Magazine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Of the Fly Tying Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And he's, how many books have you written?
Working on number 10.
Number 10.
Yep.
So if you haven't had a chance to read any of his books, I'd highly recommend it. He's the backbone behind Capwise Fly Fishing Center up
We
at
see.
Patterson School.
Weesey. Cap Weesey.
Oh, Capwease.
Weiss, yep.
Weiss.
Yep.
Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Alan.
Okay. Bob asked me to talk about the museum and the Capweesey Fly Fishing Center, and I will. But one of the things I did recently was give a brief history of our fly fishing in the South. You can read about the old flies and how we think we got started. There's a lot of history there, but when I started working on the Fly Fishing Museum, all this history was hidden away in people's minds. A couple of books, Don Kirk and Jim Cassida had written more than just about anyone else, and they were real good sources. And an interesting thing came along. Ron Beam, he was actually my PE teacher in the 7th grade, but he, real active person in Caldwell County, fished Wilson Creek, had buddies fly fish with him, and he was wanting to write a book about the fly fishermen of Caldwell County. And this is a good old boy book. It's got the buddies that fished together, and it goes all the way back to Capweesey and everything. And he was a gold mine. That book was a gold mine to get the museum started, because the real stories we wanted to capture there are local as much as we could. Now, we did people from every state in the Southeast, but there's some sweet spots, and that's why I thought this would be a real good topic to talk about. So my entire history is on this one page, and you can follow along. I'll skip all over the place, but it'll get put together hopefully. Okay, so about the middle of the page on the left, there's a thing called cradle of fly tying, number 1, number 2, and number 3. If you go down the page, okay, and I used to call these the sweet spots when we were working on the museum, because there was more of a cluster of fly fishermen that really got together and they either built rods or tied flies or whatever. And commercially, you had some tires in these places: Bryson City, Brevard, and Lenore. And I grew up in Lenore and did not have the privilege of really knowing about all this stuff that well when I was growing up. But out of all the places up and down the Southern Appalachians, I'm convinced those were the 3 sweet spots. Now, if you go over in Tennessee and start talking about it, every town was a sweet spot. There was one guy there. And if you cluster them all together, all over the up and down Tennessee, you've got the collection of people in Tennessee that did fly fishing. But they didn't get together and do things like these 3 places. And if you go to Virginia, it was more smallmouth, believe it or not. West Virginia, the mountains isolated the fly fishermen quite a bit. Georgia only has a small amount of fly fishing. Atlanta's generated a lot of the fly fishing in more recent times. So if you look at the southern states, you've got people like Lefty that came out of Maryland, which is not really connected to a lot of other fly fishermen. In fact, he was connected by salt water mostly, okay? So that's kind of the core history we have as Southern Appalachian fly fishing, okay? So let me drop back and tell you a little bit more about this handout. One of the things I did with the little color code is connect the type of fly rods we used, okay? And if you'll start, let's see, with the red, you've got the 6-strip bamboo. Okay, now that's what was the hot, expensive rod back then. But dropping back from that, it was wood. They were using greenheart, hickory, hazelwood, things like that. And they would temper that wood with fire and get it good and straight. And, the early fly fishing was dapping. Now it's Euro nipping, right? So we don't know for sure what they were doing back in 200 AD, but we know that was the first fly, okay? So I brought the oldest flies that have been replicated for display, and you'll want to see those before you leave, okay? So from the 6-strip bamboo, if you move forward, there was a telescopic steel rod that came out. And let's see if I can read this stuff good. 1887, okay? Now that didn't catch on. Part of the reason is, it's pretty strong, but if you bend it, you're in trouble. And rust, things like that. But by 1940, the idea of a wooden rod pretty much had died out. Okay, and by then, Orvis was impregnating the bamboo. Okay, so then fiberglass came along post-war and really caught on, and had a lot to do with conventional fishing. I mean, the fiberglass rod made it economical for anybody to get a great fishing rod and go fishing. So from there, the steel rod, even though it was around and not used a whole lot, died in the 50s and 60s. And then we got into the carbon fiber and graphite starting in 1964 with Hardy in England. Okay. And then Fenwick started here in 1974. And then we're into the formulated graphite rods, boron impregnated, that kind of stuff. And I don't know if you know the latest, around 2010, the S-glass came out. And what they're doing is taking fiberglass and then impregnate the fiberglass with, strengtheners, materials like boron. So if you can follow the flow of the rod, And that's, for a lot of people, the rod dates them. You know, if you talk to your grandfather, still around, he can tell you what kind of fly rod he used. Even commercial rods, you know, conventional fishing. So that's kind of a timeline of equipment. But if you look to the other side, the flies that came out during that time. So we start out with the Macedonian fly, which is nothing more than a probably a bent needle back then, but it was two feathers and just some wool, supposedly red wool, and I can't remember the color of the feathers, kind of a slate look. And nobody knows how it was tied. So the display has 4 versions that are the most likely way they tied the fly back 200 AD. We know it happened because it was written in documents by a Roman that was documenting things. But our early flies go back to the deer hair fly, which was a sliver of deer hair wrapped first on a stone hook and then later on a metal or like a bent needle and that type of thing. Cherokee. And it was easier to carry that artificial fly instead of going and getting bait to try to, get food when they was on the move, because they were hunting, things like that. The other thing that came along was the yellow hammer, which was, that leading feather off of the wing of a flicker, northern flicker, that, let's see, they used 4 of them, I think, out of the whole bird to tie yellow hammers. They split that feather and dampen it and wrap it, and you get this great looking yellow fly that you can't do anymore because it's illegal. But you can dye other types of feathers that are similar and get the same effect. Got a story about yellowhammer. Now the blackbird, crow feather, and you can still do those. And don't underestimate black. I got a story about that one too. So those were the early flies, and in the book I just finished this year, I spend a lot of time trying to tell the story about the Cherokee because nobody knows exactly what happened. There's a few documented things to go by, and the rest of it's probably this, or we speculate that this is what happened. Okay, and I'm not afraid to do that in history. We've got to fill in the gaps somehow. What is it? History goes to the writers. So if you look back, the Chinese probably had the first opportunity with their bamboo rods and everything. We don't know anything about it. We just speculate that they probably did their fishing with the bamboo pole. And then we know the Japanese used tenkari way back, and they started out with the wood poles and everything. So this is our background that we start with. Over here in other countries, they did it somehow. And so, it's not far-fetched that our mountain folk just took a hickory tree and skinned it and used fire to make it stiff, hard, straight, and made them a dapper and used something like a yellowhammer or a blackbird that the Cherokee were using. Okay. Now, the documented cases of the Cherokee tying go all the way back to the 1700s. So somewhere they might have picked it up from settlers. They could have picked it up from the Spanish that came through earlier. Somehow they got it, and they got to doing it. You might say it was here when we arrived, sort of. So the fly fisherman that's best documented in our southern realm is Thad Norris, and he was in Virginia, and a lot of that influence came from north of there, Pennsylvania and Trouttown, Roscoe, New York, Catskills, and he was known as literally the father of fly fishing for the South, and his favorite was the Norris coachman. Coachman has a history of coming from the coachman in Europe or in England that he had a buggy whip and he tied flies and he tied the coachman. somewhere along the way it got to be the Royal Coachman with some modification. But regardless, a lot of different people have tied different coachmans along the way. Norris was one of the early ones for us, and that's that's documented. So up until the 1880s, the history is pretty sparse. When I was working on the museum, I used to say, well, if it's before 1850, we don't know enough about it to really do a whole lot. So there's things in there, timeline and some other things in the museum that document that best we can. But most of our history starts mid-1800s. And so the first thing that we talk about is the logging. Now, here we are, we want to fly fish, and they come along and they're logging all the trees out of the southern Appalachians. Big demand for wood. And so we destroy the very thing we have back then. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what we did. So in the 1920s and 30s, we finally came out of that mode and realized that we've destroyed everything we've got. They went west and started logging out there, you might say. Things started changing. We ended the logging, and then we had to do some kind of recovery, and that's where the CC camps came along, and they were stocking rainbows and browns and destroying brook along the way. Of course, we'd destroyed a lot of the brook by then anyway, There was one fella that started doing the poppers, and you can still buy them today, Peck's Popper. You go in the bath downstairs, you'll find Peck's Popper. That company has existed since 1920 when he started doing those. And he sold flies, but he sold more of the popper because it was a surface fly and it worked on the lakes. And if you think about it, a lot of our streams were destroyed then, so it's probably better fishing at the lakes and everything. So that's one of the earliest, you might say, flies, even though they were pretty chunky. Pretty much a bass fly. Took off in Virginia for sure. And the first real commercial fly fishing came when people wanted to visit from Washington and New York, and they'd come down to the Smokies. And a lot of the Smokies, you might say, weren't destroyed as bad as some of the other places in southern Appalachia. And a guy named Mark Cathy, Uncle Mark, would guide the visitors. And Jim Castor would write about Mark Cathy a lot, and he's got a lot of reputation from that. But he basically used 2 flies, a bamboo rod, and he guided people. That's what he did. There's more stories behind some of the fly tires in the Bryson City area than there is about Mark Cathy, but that was his fame. So as we're stocking and recovering the creeks in the southern Appalachian, all these other things started happening, but a lot of it, believe it or not, happened up in Caldwell County and Wilson Creek, of all places. And if you've ever fished Wilson, I'd say most of you have been there. I don't know why they call it a creek. It's pretty big water, but it flows into a river, so I guess that's how they decided that. I don't know who Wilson was myself, but Cap Weesey was a headmaster of Patterson School for Boys there in Lenoir, and he would take one of the boys, and the 2 of them would go fish in Wilson Creek for the day and catch enough big browns to take back and feed everybody a Friday night fish fry, the whole school. Now, the school had probably 75, 80 kids. So it wasn't a big school, but still a lot of fish. And back then, when they were recovering the creeks and everything, they didn't have the canopies we have now. So yeah, the water could be warmer, but that's 6 weeks out of the year. The rest of the time, if you stock rainbows and trout in the browns in those waters, they're going to take off if there's any kind of bugs. Well, with no canopy, the mayflies were a lot more abundant than they are today. We see mostly caddis flying. Stoneflies are more nocturnal. Don't see those as much. They're in the water, but you got to fish Euro nymph or something to get them. So this guy, Cap Weesey, got a reputation. He taught any of the boys that wanted to learn to fly fish, he taught them to cast right there on the pond on the campus. We've restored that pond now, and we've got the Wildlife Commission doing an education class every month. Some of them are casting lessons. Project Hill and Waters comes in there and they use the pond. They did a grant. We've rebuilt the old pier. I mean, when we saw the pond the first time, it had stubs where the old pier was, and we just capped those stubs and rebuilt it. So Cap had two buddies. One of them was Newland Saunders. And Newland was a fly tyer. He created the sheep fly. Anybody heard about the sheep fly? Okay. The story goes that they were around cow dung, and this it's like a deer fly was flying around, and it was big and obnoxious to everybody, and he wanted to duplicate that. But at the same time, he used gray body because he knew like the atoms and all that. Gray worked really good. In fact, I think he accidentally created a crane fly larva with the wet fly version of the sheep fly, because it's just a big old gray body with a couple wings. That don't matter if it's sinking, So the sheep fly got well known to the point where when the Howell brothers sold it in Brevard, it was called the Howell fly. Okay. And so the stories go around, and you might say the credit gets lost a little bit, and that's not all that unusual. Even today, you tie a good fly, next thing you know, somebody's horned in on that, right? So, but the sheep fly was probably the best known fly in this state, at least. In Tennessee, it was the gremlin, and that is the predecessor to the Tennessee wolf. It was green with one collar instead of two collars like a wolf. Everything else pretty much the same. But now Cap had his own fly, the early Nelson, named after Lord Nelson, because he was very inclined to follow the British methods when he fished. Kind of all you had back then, Now, Newland was called Zip because he just never sat still. He was always busy, always tying flies. And he tied a number of flies. The big yellow mayfly was one of his really good flies. And what we've tried to do, Tom Adams and I, over the years, have done Fly of the Month and posted out there on the website for Rocky River. And we've managed to do probably 50 Southern Appalachian patterns. And we've tried to do some of these that you don't hear about as much. And then a guy named Messenger up in West Virginia, off by himself. This guy actually took the back seat out of his Woody and set up a fly tying bench. He was handicapped. He had trouble walking. He used sticks, wading sticks to get into the river to fish and everything. But that didn't slow him down. And he invented the irresistible. I don't think that's the name it started out as, but he had a special way of clumping deer hair and packing it together so he could do a two-tone. And to this day, the true irresistible is tied not with deer hair spun, but clumped. And his son and his grandson know the method, and they teach that method. But it's, you don't see it a whole lot unless you up their way, or you go to a fly fishing show and he happens to be there. That's pretty unique stuff. That didn't happen somewhere else in this country. It happened in the South. And he did the bucktail frog and night hummer. There's two or three he was well known for. So that's happening up in West Virginia. Now, we were able to get Joe Messenger down for the Hall of Fame and everything. He's well connected with us and everything. The people that had the biggest reputation in Bryson City was Fred and Aline Hall, and they tied for a living. And things like the thunderhead, which is kind of a wolf fly, there's probably three different stories about the thunderhead and where it originated. One's Tennessee, one's North Carolina. And I found that a lot of our history is like that there's a story on the Tennessee side totally the opposite of the one on the North Carolina side. Hard to tell sometimes. But, we can pick and choose when you're writing about it sometimes. But they tied, like the Adams variant, very unique with the yellow ostrich pearl in the center. And they sold these flies, and the Howe brothers sold their flies and, in fact, started tying some of their own. One of theirs was the, let's see if I can remember what it was here. Oh, they started doing back scratcher. Don't use it. Yeah. Go down and fish with Kevin Howe a little bit, and you'll find out a whole lot about the back scratcher. But they did woven nymphs, which take a little bit more time. Who was in this group that did weaving? Was it Gary? Gary, yeah. So over in Brevard, they mostly built rods, but they started doing a bunch of flies. There's a book out that I think Kevin helped finish that his dad and uncle had started, and they've got maybe a dozen or so flies. And Kevin tied those flies, and we've put that in the museum. We've taken a lot of Cap's flies. We got original Cap flies that he tied, and Newland Saunders, and they're in the museum. A guy named Bill Everhart up in Lenore, he's in his late 80s now, still ties. He tied 15 versions of the yellowhammer. He would modify and create another one. Very, very creative guy. And I talked to him the other day, and he had tied 30 flies for his grandchildren as Christmas present. And that's pretty good stuff. Can't beat that. So, where are we at here? One of the things when we put the museum together is we wanted eye candy. When you come into the museum, you want to see something that is striking, get your attention, make you feel like this place is worth spending some time in. So we went after the first drift boat in the Southeast. And that was a tricky story too, because first was 4 different people. And it's a little uncertainty about which one was really first. A guy named Ronnie Hall took John boats down the Chattahoochee in Georgia. And he still guides today. This was 1980s when he was doing that. And then Theo Copeland started taking a big raft down the Watauga. And he's still guiding. Now, he lost his brother, but he's still guiding. Gary Taylor built a Mackenzie straight from the blueprints he got from Oregon, because he didn't want to pay shipping on a new one from Oregon. And so in his shop, he built and did the, what they call it, the clear resin, sealed it up. I mean, this gorgeous boat. We bought that boat for the museum because he was still using it when we went after it. And Wanda Taylor didn't want to sell it to the museum. They wanted to keep using it. So Gary ended up getting a Clackercraft dealership with the money we paid him for the boat. I think it's $7,500. The first money I raised for the museum, we did a banquet at Harris, where we made $16,000 and Harris made $55,000. That banquet ain't the way to raise money. Those are the stories of the past. So we have the first Mackenzie boat that was built and used in the Southeast, and it was still being used when we got it. And then the final story was Kevin Howe. He started taking people down the French Broad, and sometimes it was musky fly fishing, because not a lot of people do that. But nonetheless, Theo and Kevin used rafts at first before they got into Mackenzie's or something like that. So there's 4 stories basically of how we started, and all that's in the museum. Interesting stuff. And then one of the biggest things that have changed everything, this is not just Southeast, the book River Runs Through It came out. And next thing you know, everybody wants to be a fly fisherman. And a lot of people are discovering that it's not their thing. But there's a lot more fly fishermen today than there ever was back in, in the 80s and 90s when I was fishing, for sure. So now we got into competition, and competition is bringing the type of flies that we want to use. Euro nymphing is catching on as one of the methods. Now, it's kind of like tenkari to me. I don't get to cast, and I love to cast a fly. So I also like to catch fish. So what do you do when you cast all day and you're not catching fish? Pull out the other rod and get that Euro nymph rod out. I took a young friend fishing a few weeks ago, and I caught this was real marginal water, and I'll tell you about it. We're stocking. It's up at Patterson, and I caught rock bass, and I can't remember what it was now. A couple other fish, not a trout, but we had stocked rainbows in there, and he comes up through there and he's casting, not catching trout either, and so he goes back to his Euro rod, and he wrenches out 6 of the biggest rainbows we've put in that place. And, they're down in the troughs and hiding away real good. He convinced me that's pretty good method. So how many's tried Euro nymphing and tenkari? How many's tried tenkari? To me, the advantage of tenkari is if you're backpacking, you don't want to carry a lot of gear, hold that thing up, stick it in your pocket and go. Because there's not a lot to it. Bigger rods, more limber tip. Let that rod do the work. I'm amazed that how you can keep a fish on with, and you can get away with bigger tippet than you think when you're wrenching down, putting the fly right in their face. So, yeah. So in Virginia, the person that's probably made, you might say, the most history is Harry Murray, Mr. Rapidan. But if you read his books and stuff, you'll find he's done a couple of dozen different flies with that name. It's either Murray or Mr. Rapidan flies. So, and then Harrison Steves. Now Harrison served on the museum board for a year, and he brings terrestrials to the forefront in the South. Yep. Now Blaine is one of the more recent success too. It's amazing how you can take a good idea and expand it and make a good commercial living off of it. So this will give you an idea of what the Southern history is like. Okay, I know probably 300 fly patterns that are well known if you talk to the right person about the Southeast that have come from here. We're good at copycat too. The Thunderhead, to me, is an excellent example. We don't know if it came before the Wolf did. We don't know that. Wolf came in, 1929? So Lee Wolf might have been tying that years before that, before he really, where it made a scene. Well, Fred Hall was tying, the Thunderheads back about that time too. And you don't know if they were on the phone together, probably not. But somebody came from somewhere and told somebody, and the next thing you know, you got to try that. So you can still go to service stations back around Bryson City and pick up Thunderheads because locals tie it. And I've been able to reach some of those locals and get them to tie patterns for the museum. And so it's a real interesting mix, and it's not untypical how history gets made. Okay, so questions about our history.
I noticed that you're talking about flies a lot. What about line? What did they do for line, like especially in the ancient times?
Catgut. Yep. Silk. They used a braided material, and they would soak it so that it floated. And we didn't have plastics until the 40s. and I've heard that our fly line is probably the greatest invention of all the technology we have that we use, because you got a core with, a plastic coating, and you can make it sink or you can make it float real good. And back then, they were trying to figure that stuff out with different methods. I know everything in this box here, the tippets are snooted horsehair, and in the early stages, you could get a horsehair leader, but it was expensive because somebody had to, get. Yep, that's right. Yeah, I've got an old catgut leader in a spool that I have on my wall at home that my grandfather used, and it's deteriorated. You couldn't do anything with it now. It's just laying on the reel.
By the way, there's a good YouTube video showing how one of the popular manufacturers, they took somebody on a tour and they videoed the whole thing.
Yeah.
And showed how they made the line and then ran it through a machine that got the coating on there and so forth.
And see, fluorocarbon is a great invention because it's clear in the water. Now, the real small stuff, I think it tangles and twists real easy. And, they're still working on getting that perfected. You do an additive and it becomes something different, but you got to do an additive that's clear. So let the technology keep working, but it's not too bad right now. I noticed with Euronymping, you use the 2-color mono, and that's a method Ken Kastroff uses up on the Nantahala when he's floating down, and he wants you to keep that nymph at a certain level above the rocks, and he uses that. Was it Amnesia? I guess that is the brand with 2 colors. Yeah.
I've tried to hunt him down a couple times.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I fish that area.
He uniquely takes one person down the river while the wheels are turning, because he gives you very precise, timely instruction on where to cast when. You're going out there going real fast, and there's a pocket. He's got you ready. You got one I remember fishing a double dry. Never do that much, but 2 dries in that pocket gives you twice the odds. And you wrench out a nice big rainbow out of a pocket, right? And you're gone. You're pulling behind you. But he would say, never cast overhead, because you're always under stuff down through there. And I remember twice I forgot. Yep, in a tree. And using he calls it a Royal Prince, and it was on a jig. So to me, he had the early Euro nip right there. That's what he was using. And he swears by it. Yeah. So got all kinds of examples. It's just like the Dapper. And we had the Dapper long before they had the 10 and 12 foot rods to reach through the rhododendron and get to the pool, right? All right. 2 stories. The black fly. Jim Henson lives in Heartland, which is a suburb of Gamel, which is a suburb of Lenore. Just being funny. He ties what he calls the black fly, and he just takes a hook and puts lead all over it, but he shapes it like a bee, big abdomen, skinny like an ant, okay? And he coats it with black floss, acetate floss, and he soaks it in acetate so it gets a real shiny, complete, seamless sheen to it. And then he ties 4 crow feathers on it. So it don't look like any particular insect, but I've watched him use this fly because it goes straight down like a Euro nymph, and he comes up with a fish every time with it. I fished this one pool ahead of him, didn't catch a thing, and I looked back and he's just grinning with a big brown that he just caught with him. So don't underestimate black. Okay, that's the one story. Now the other story is the yellowhammer. Cap Weesey passed on his fly tying materials to one of his kids named Ed Jones. Ed Jones lived in Cary and passed away It's probably been almost 10 years now. But his wife saw Lefty at a fly fishing show because she fly fishes. And Lefty suggested that all the Cap Weesey materials go to the museum down here because she was talking to Catskills. And of course, they've got a lot of Lefty stuff. And so she contacted me, and I ended up with just boxes and boxes and boxes of material from Cap Weesey, and hardly any tools or anything else. You know, those have gotten dispersed everywhere. So I look, and I'm trying to organize all this stuff and get rid of the stuff that's old and, you know, has gotten eaten up with moss and stuff. And here's one of those big old jars, and it's not a gallon, it's like 2.5 gallon jar full of yellowhammer feathers. And it's 4 to a bird. And I bet there's probably 50 birds. Yeah.
Bird now extinct or what?
No, they're not. But they're protected because they're a woodpecker. Okay. You know, they sit there on the tree and they're sitting ducks. So they're protected. So I've got a lot of yellowhammer feathers hidden away. I don't know what to do with them, you know. I know.
Well, it's museums.
It is a museum, but I've tried to find out what we should do. You know, you can find. I had a flicker fly into the window 2 weeks ago. Yeah, that happens too. When I was doing the museum, Chris Holler